1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Je fais comme ça. 1, 2. 1, 2. Je te dis si je suis au début d'escalier au final, ok? Au milieu. Ok, maintenant je sors de la salle. Ok, ici je suis dans la salle. Au début d'escalier. Qu'est-ce que vous faites ici? In the middle of the stairs. Ça va? Oui, ça va. Ah, ça va? Ouais. Et maintenant, au début, presque au début. Ok, là je suis au début, the beginning of the stairs. Ok? Tu veux que j'essaie? Ok. I'm at the beginning of the stairs. I'm at the beginning of the stairs. I will go down. I'm going down. Il a toujours... I'm in the middle of the stairs. I'm going down. I'm in the beginning of the stairs. Ok, très bien. Oui, c'est les antennes qui font la différence.
Ok, génial.
Ok.
Tant que j'y suis, je vais aussi préparer les autres micros, mettre les...
Hi again. I hope you had a nice lunch break. Welcome back. So we're going to start the afternoon session of this symposium with first a talk by Fabian Schöneich. And then Corey Archangel will join us on Zoom because, as Bettina mentioned this morning, he was a bit sick and so wasn't able to attend in person. And he will join us for a lecture performance online. And then we will end on a panel discussion with all of the participants, or all of the contributors to the symposium, moderated by Bettina Steinbrugger. So I'm going to introduce Fabian. Fabian Schöneich is the founder and director of CCA Berlin. He was previously curator at Porticus in Frankfurt, where he realized numerous solo and group exhibitions with artists such as Minu Klim, Otto Bongan-Konga, Lawrence Abu Hamdan, or Amy Silman. He also curated the 2013 and 2014 editions of the Listed Art Fair Basel Performance Project, featuring notably Adam Linder, Michael Dean, Anne Himov, Lydia Lewis, among others. Fabian Schöneich is also the editor of numerous publications and monographs. So I leave the floor to you, Fabian.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure being here and listening to amazing contributions. So I might repeat a few things, but I'm hopefully adding a few other thoughts to the discussion around Majerus. You can't drink milk all the time, it turns sour sometimes too. It's a quote that comes, as we heard already, from a notebook of Majerus that was published, a notebook series from 1995. It says, all paintings have to be painted anew. When I say all paintings, then I mean all those paintings we know and we no longer want to see because they've had their day. You can't drink milk all the time, it turns sour sometimes too, and because all painting is derived from influences of nature anyway, the natural process of renewal is inevitably at work here as well. It's all about inventing the invented. The violence of abstraction makes repeating unavoidable. Michel Majerus was an artist of the present. Super young, super successful, super fast, super colorful, super different, super in many respects, but times change, and so does the look at the work of a painter like Majerus. The question of the symposium itself, what looks good today may not look good tomorrow, is basically the core of the whole discussion around Majerus' practice. What are we talking about here? We're talking about the work of a painter who was born and raised in Luxembourg, studied in Stuttgart, lived in Berlin, in the literal meaning of the word, and in the end died much too early and tragically on his way to Luxembourg. A perfect circle, one could say. In a very short but intense career, Majerus created a considerable body of work and was equally lucky. Lucky in the sense of the people he met, who were defining for his career and still are today. Also the exhibitions which he could realize must be highlighted. His first solo exhibition took place in 1992 at the Galerie Zellermeier in Berlin. Only 4 years later, in 1996, he had his first major institutional solo exhibition at Kunsthalle Basel, which is a template for the current exhibition at Berlin's KW Institute for Contemporary Arts, which just opened recently. On the left-hand side, so you see the Kunsthalle Basel installation view. On the right-hand side, an image from last Sunday's my personal gallery visit to see the show. Floor is taken over by the Kunsthalle. There's different elements in the show that brings together early works as such, but it's quite nice to see both of these installation views together because it also probably is an interesting starting point for later to discuss how the work itself was not only shown again, but like very much restaged as it was shown while he was alive. The symposium is dedicated to him and his work, and I will try to focus on how he worked and especially how he perceived his environment and translated it into an artistic practice. In doing so, I will propose to look at his work not only from an art historical perspective, but rather to emphasize the social and political qualities of work. The work we're dealing with today is, as I said, extensive and yet limited. Perhaps that's why it's so powerful. We look at these paintings and installations and think, wow, they describe what characterized the 90s. Techno, super graphics, computer games, and Berlin on the rise after reunification. All of Europe seemed to look at Berlin as the new capital, particularly for art. In Germany, it was formerly Cologne, but suddenly Berlin became the capital for new exciting art, ideas, and music. It was out with the old and in with the new, and Majerus was an example of this, said Daniel Birnbaum in an earlier interview. The city itself was a blank canvas, possibilities endless, and yet our perspective on that time has changed. So what were the 90s? Were they indeed formative, or was it a brief period of liberation that was really about nothing? A moment of relaxation, just having fun? Yes, and certainly in Berlin. This freedom runs through the work like a thread. Majerus tried things out, walked around Berlin, was inspired by just about everything. The sampling, which you always read about when discussing the artist's techniques, may come from that. He brings it all together, mixing art history with popular culture. Majerus did not necessarily criticize the painting that came before him. Rather, he used it and put together what he needed. That way, he didn't have to reinvent what was already there. He had a great fondness of 20th century painting, which was reflected in references to numerous and, to be emphasized here, exclusively male artists, including Andy Warhol, Frank Stella, Gerhard Richter, Jean-Michel Basquiat, Julian Schnabel, Mark Rothko, Sigmar Polke, Willem de Kooning, and his mentors, Kossuth and Sonderberg. Let's look at OT collaborations number 8 here in the background. The General Electric logo already existed. He used it and combined it with motifs from the joint works of Warhol and Basquiat. Motifs that already existed as well. Mix and match what belongs together, according to the artist. Majerus was not a painter who celebrated the classical artistic suffering in order to create a painting. Rather, he enjoyed life and transferred his liveliness to the surface of the picture, but also into the space. The canvas was not a boundary, but only one of many levels. The space, whether it was the exhibition space or the city itself, another. Friedrich Mesche, the former director of the Kunsthalle Bielefeld, describes his as bilderstürmerisch. You have to destroy something to create something new. And Daniel Birnbaum elaborates, Majerus quoted the history of painting in its entirety, but he never moralized or indulged in melancholy reflections on the loss of authenticity. Instead, his work celebrated the profusion of images to which the history of art has given rise. The temporality of his work, I claimed and still do, is that of a floating, all-encompassing now, perhaps analogous to that of the internet. This being situated in the now, which Daniel Birnbaum speaks of here, becomes more and more relevant in the artist's work. The more relevant it becomes, the more I think the reading of his early exhibition changes. What I'm interested in here are two questions. On one hand, I'm thinking about why his work so precisely reflects his time and is therefore still relevant today. The other question is whether his work is political. I think both questions are very close to each other. As I said, 1990s, for a large part of the younger generation, it was about having fun. Of course, there was political protest and social change, but especially in Berlin, that should play a smaller role for a moment. To claim that today's time is more serious sounds out of touch. Nevertheless, we look at many things differently today, or more consciously. We know that the art history we learned exclusively reflected a Western discourse. We not only think about equality, but actively try to implement it consistently, although it is absurd that we are still trying and that it has not simply become a reality long ago. The world and its societies are more interconnected, and yet there's a global unease The gap between rich and poor is widening very quickly, and right-wing populism is making its way into many cabinets. And it is war. It actually began a year before Majerus' death with the war in Afghanistan, then the Iraq War, which also contributed to political life in Europe. And since the beginning of the year, we live with the immediate consequences of the Russian war of aggression on Ukraine. And the role of art. We continue to question it and try to develop a social discourse in parallel. At least we know that the museum should not only collect and preserve, but also bring people together, like today. Back to Majerus. Looking at his work, it's primarily form and color that jump out, but if we concentrate on what we see, we realize that Majerus didn't just use whatever he found, but he had a great talent to perceive very, very precisely his environment, with a very clear focus on the youth culture of this time. Donkey Kong, Super Mario, and other characters from popular video games, manga characters, sneakers, videotapes, corporate logos, and brands. We all see these symbols today and know exactly what is meant. They are icons of what was the religion of the time. At first I wondered how an artist like him would have worked in today's modern times. Would augmented or virtual reality have been his medium? Would his work have shifted more and more into digital space, and would NFTs have become his image carriers? Is it possible that Majerus would have collaborated with Balenciaga? Possibly. Or maybe he would have just kept painting. It doesn't matter to think about these what-ifs. Rather, it should be about applying his approach to today and not just repeating what was then, but translating him and his work into a new context. The idea of the symposium is also for people to engage with Majerus, who previously had no direct connection to him and his work. One of these people is me, who had no direct connection. I was therefore all the more pleased about the invitation to engage with, and this engagement made me all the more curious to learn more. My interest in contemporary art is always also an interest in how art can be seen and understood in a social and political context. It is important to me that it does not have to be understood, and that the non-understanding is essential. So the question I ask myself is whether his work has this political level. I think there's an interesting shift in the work, or maybe shift is the wrong word. Rather, in career, works emerge here and there that deal more decisively with the political realities of this time. If we remember what Sarah mentioned earlier in the talk, I think this idea of rhythm is super interesting, because if you would look at this very short career of Majerus as such, there is a very kind of like, let's say, enthusiastic rhythm in the beginning of his career, where he produces a lot of work and is kind of very kind of like motivated and inspired by being in Berlin. And then there comes this kind of like breakthrough with big exhibitions all over the place, and this rhythm accelerates to a very kind of like fast pace, almost close to a heart attack, I would imagine. And then suddenly I think there's this shift. And the shift is kind of like, for me, the Sozialpalast, where I'm going to talk about later, but the shift is when the rhythm changes back to a very kind of like solid, but extremely loud and precise, slow rhythm of very specific statements. Thank you for that inspiring idea that I just used. Celebration Generation from 1994 is a very peculiar interweaving of a personal, obviously racist listing of the apparent political goals of the major German parties from the perspective of an anonymous K-Alber from Berlin-Mitte. To read about it, it says, "Withered of the sonic celebration generation, rave and, somewhere over the rainbow, it takes me away. Go ahead." The first two lines are album names of Westbam, a German DJ. The last three lines are song titles from the album Raveland from 1994 by the German Greek DJ Marusha. An entanglement of two realities, but perhaps also the beginning of a parallel view of Majerus at this time. The quotations that overlay the surface come from a parallel world, just as this listing itself comes from a separate world. There are two respective clashes in the same society. Both have nothing to do with each other, and yet they are to be found in the same time and place in Berlin. Let's go back to living in the now that Daniel Birnbaum talked about it, and look at the exhibition Gemälde, his first gallery show with Neuke Riemschneider in Berlin 1994, on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, a one-to-one restage of the very same exhibition that opened in the now much bigger gallery space of Neuke Riemschneider in Berlin last Sunday. A complete takeover of the small exhibition space with paintings on all walls, drawings, prints, paintings above. The floor covered with a thick layer of asphalt. Majerus here not only brought the street into the gallery, but translated one-on-one what he saw. It may seem cool and different, but it's basically the political reality of a youth that moved through the city and became more and more visual. And instead of taking his art outside, he took it inside. He did it later again in 2000 at the Kölnischer Kunstverein by building a skate ramp inside. If we are dead, so it is. Just also, I don't know if you actually realized, obviously, I think personally it's a very cool move to bring this half pipe into the gallery space of Kölnischer Kunstverein, but then for everyone who actually does skateboard, it's a very infunctional ramp because there's no headspace. So you couldn't really use it. It was only later in 2 occasions where it was reinstalled again in a public space that it was a fully functional skateboard ramp. It's almost like a skateboard ramp built by a nerd who likes the aesthetic of skateboarding into the arts. With these installations, people often talk about how he brought the aesthetics of the outdoor space into the indoor space. Perhaps today we should also talk more about how he brought the issues of the street into art. He was a critic of his time. I think the peak of his political constant in his work was reached in 2002, when he was able to realize his Sozialpalast. While the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin was being renovated and roofed over for this purpose, there was a moment when Majerus could occupy this place. He had a photograph, as you heard, of a building in Berlin-Schöneberg, the Palaceum, printed on tarpaulin, a block of flats that was also called a social hotspot. The Berlin Morgenpost, one of the kind of more gossipy Berlin newspapers, wrote, "With a spectacular art action, BEWAG, the city's electricity company, has now moved the Schöneberg Sozialpalast, of all places, right into the good parlor of Berlin. The spokesman for the energy company says, but the less beautiful sides of Berlin are also part of this city. The artwork forces visitors to stop and think about it." Klaus Wolf from Rudow, a part of Berlin, also thinks it's good to show what it's still like here in Berlin, and he adds, "They over there," he nods toward the Adlon Hotel, a luxury hotel next to the gate, "should think about how the people in the social palace have to live. The retired policeman used to work there himself and knows what he's talking about." Daniel Birnbaum, the curator of the project, sums it up by saying that the piece he did for Berlin rather was a huge political statement about multiculturalism. Unemployment, how the government spends its money, what's to be remembered culturally, what's to be taken away, and also, this remains important in Germany, what deserves to be rebuilt. The most important element in discussing the extent to which Majerus' work was politically informed is time. In principle, the only real factor of it all. Time matters not only because he lived and worked for a short time, but because his work was set in his time. The imagery of his environment is fast, and so at any moment it could happen that the ground slips from under his feet. References to the most up-to-date visual motifs may look good in the moment, but there's danger that they will all age too quickly together and then simply fall out of circulation, meaning that they will look old. Majerus knew that. A number of his paintings and large installations call out to the viewers, as the Symposium suggests, what looks good today may not look good tomorrow. Writes Stefan Heidenreich in the catalogue of the exhibition, "Everything Appears More Serious in the USA at Kunsthalle Bielefeld." Majerus knows that his use of brands, logos, and comic references must be well thought out and that they must not appear at some point to be meaningless or out of time. The work must remain timeless, the references in this sense neutral. This neutrality within his radical visual language is an attitude, the attitude of an observer. Heidenreich also writes about the fact that Sozialpalast takes references to social and political representational conditions like no other work. The work does not really change, but a different strategy is used. The user plays a greater role, while in other works those figures were represented that were consumed, Teletubbies, or controlled, Super Mario, by the user. Now it is about the user himself. Already in If We're Dead, So It Is, the skateboard ramp in Cologne, he came into play in the figure of the skater. Now it's about real people and the so not beautiful reality of their lives. What is different today? The subcultures that informed Majerus back then have disappeared or dissolved into the respective brand worlds. Computer games are no longer just for nerds, but form an enormous billion-dollar market served by millions of users. Comics and mangas continue to exist, cosplay is now more visible in Europe, skateboarding is still on the streets and perhaps the closest thing to an independent subculture, refusing to be luxury. While sneaker, still cool, has become an important element of the luxury industry itself. I think luxury plays a major role as it attempts to simulate the artist's practice in today's world. In recent years, there has been a huge shift in the number of buyers, and so the strategy of the luxury industry have changed and adapted. At the same time, even though fashion has always been inspired by art, it is being incorporated more and more. The luxury industry knows how to use art to legitimize itself. The cultural potential masked the capitalist core. Even today, there are artists who in a striking way reflect what makes up our society or dominates today's youth. Practices that go beyond a discourse conducted solely in art. Anne Imhoff is certainly one of them, as she simulated an image of youth that is incredibly close to reality. And then the fashion industry came along and swallowed it. There's the French artist Mohamed Bourou Issa, whose photographs and videos take a critical look at the image in the mass media and show people who are left behind at the interface between integration and exclusion. Or Takeshi Murakami, whose work can be reminded of Majerus in form of color, and within which he uses characters from Japanese anime, images from the post-World War II era, and the Japanese art history. However, it took him a while to get on the same level like Majerus. There are more, of course. You can't drink milk all the time. It turns sour sometimes too. Majerus wrote in his notes in 1995, calling for all paintings to be painted anew. You actually should all get this book. Probably the estate sends it to the universities you're coming from. It's kind of essential because it changes the way you look at his work while reading his very kind of like short and precise thoughts about it. The fact that milk goes bad once does not mean that you will never drink milk again. Everything has an expiration date. Majerus was an innovator who was aware of his time but didn't get stuck. Perhaps he would have continued as he was. He would have made art that was neutral in some ways, but also precise, aggressive, and loud, that brought the street into the gallery and art into the outer space. However, his work should be looked at not only from an art historical perspective, but also from a social critical one. In doing so, his strategy should be elaborated, because that is what is timeless and from which we can still learn so much today. Namely, not only to recognize the necessity in the art of a time, but to implement it again and again, to paint the pictures anew and those to leave the old pictures their own space. Thank you.
Thank you, Fabian. I really appreciated that in your talk you link Majerus to the wider context of where he lived in, so like the city of Berlin, and also the context of the city of Berlin after the fall of the wall, with like this kind of bursting of new art and new ideas that was probably allowed by all this available space, and like so it felt like full of possibilities. And so you just opened a new space in Berlin, which, as we saw earlier, is a city that is changing at the moment and kind of like tuning in with neoliberalism, I guess, with like much more competition in the art scene, higher rents, like all of that. So I was wondering what is at stake basically in like opening a new space, a new art space, a new art institution in Berlin at the moment compared to maybe the time Majerus was active?
I think, I mean, like, obviously the city has changed tremendously since he was living in Berlin. And there was this enthusiasm of a lot of like artists, but also gallerists, collectors coming to this time, like engaging with the city. Maybe not so much engaging, just using it, because there was suddenly so much space available, like this blank canvas reference. But then it's also interesting that like this kind of the saturation or like the discussion around Berlin, not so much then actually happened in the past 30 years in like proper, I don't know, developing of an artistic communities. There's a lot of artists living in the city that have amazing studios, but they show internationally. There's a lot of great galleries in the city that somehow have their own communities, but they're mainly also visible internationally. So I think what I'm interested in is something that I would probably assume of Majerus. What I try to say is that at a certain point, his work became much more precise in terms of looking at his actually social and political surrounding. Like in the beginning, he looks at brands, he looks at surfaces, he looks at graffiti, he sees an LED sign in a kiosk, and he's inspired and he uses it, and he knows how to kind of like use all these elements to also outdate all the existing male painters that were there before him. But then with the ramp, there was still this kind of like street style in his work, but then with the Sozialpalast, suddenly there is this actual reality that is not only the surface. It might be a surface as it's a print, but like there is suddenly it's about people. It's about like a huge division of poor and rich. It's about this kind of like idea of Berlin as a divided city that is still somehow divided.
Thank you. Any question from the audience?
Thank you. Thank you, Fabian, for this great lecture. I'm wondering how you connect this very particular reactivation of the exhibition spaces, or that the exhibitions of Majerus, both at the Kunsthalle Basel and NKW, and then Neuer Riemschneider in the 90s and now. So is there in this choice a sociopolitical aspect that is translated into that reenactment that you see? Because it's interesting that that the pieces that you showed today, also part of the exhibitions in Berlin, are commenting directly to a sociopolitical reality. That it's still not obsolete. The crises back then are still not obsolete, like migration crisis, economic crisis. So it's interesting to see that by reactivating the spaces, we have two different time. So I don't want to answer this for you. Excuse me. This was a question. Yeah. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Good question. I mean, obviously, 20 years have passed since Majerus passed away. There is a completely different discourse today, probably also a completely different awareness of how you would look at works. This exhibition happened in the gallery, and I think even if you only would focus now on a purely art world discourse or art historical perspective, it's already interesting that an exhibition like that at Neuer Riemschneider 1994, young, naive gallerists invite a young, naive painter to open a show in a 15 square meter space, and it becomes such a relevant piece, compared to today, where Young Gallery opens usually a 200 square meter space and is immediately visible in New York, London, Tokyo, and Paris, for instance. I think already like within the art world there's a shift, because back then it was much more about, I would say, and if you would go through like art history books, about specific necessities and qualities of practice and trusting a work and trusting in an artist, and not only about representation of the institution of a gallery or an actual institution. So this is interesting on one hand side, but then also obviously today the discourse has changed. That's why today this discussion must take place. Like looking at this work and think about it, like it's not only cool that he brought asphalt into the gallery space, but it also means something. And why does it mean something? What does asphalt mean as a connotation, as a symbol of like a youth culture, but also of a social reality? So I think that like artworks in general are discussed more broadly in social and political terms, is a development that wasn't so present back then, but now it is. So I think this shift should happen, specifically with such exhibitions like that. On one hand side, I also find it problematic to continuously like restage the shows like they were. It's also not the first time. It was already once set up like that in Graz, I think. For me, it's beautiful because I like to see it, how it was, and especially now to see like the small gallery space within the big gallery space is also interesting. Like time travel, Back to the Future would be a good Majerus reference. Yeah, hope that answers.
Anyone else?
Thank you for your presentation. I don't know how much you already answered the question I'm gonna ask, because I don't really understand English that good, but I feel like today, when you are a young artist, it's like touchy to don't talk, don't show, don't represent social problems and political issues and stuff like that. And I want, and like draw Mario or TV reality shows or stuff like that. And I wanted to know if Michel Majerus had the same questions, and if he was criticized sometimes, or if it was new, so nobody had nothing to say about how he used his talent.
His what?
His skills.
Yeah. I mean, you mean if like the first part I didn't quite understand. Today, as a young artist, it is necessary or not, or like to be socially aware?
Wait.
It seems like not okay to just talk about silly stuff like TV shows and.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah.
Yes.
I know what you mean. I wouldn't agree necessarily, but like it's. I mean, if you read about Majerus and you look into his practice, and this you can do with many other artists somehow, he's a bit special in that regard. He was a complete nerd. He was only working. It was almost like an autistic approach. We just talked about it with Tim, his gallerist. He had this almost like a mania. He only went, like, he walked through the city, he saw everything, like, I don't know, using a digital camera until the memory card is full, and then he disappeared to the studio and he painted everything he saw until he slept. And then his friends went to a rave, he joined them, but he slept on the sofa because he wanted to be awake to go back to the studio. There's other artists, like I think Christopher Rule wrote about him, that when he had to travel at 6 in the morning, he spent the night in the studio painting because he liked to look at new works when he returned from his travel. So he was only producing in a very strange but also fascinating way, obviously. And this doesn't really have changed today. I think the appreciation of such a practice that developed such a specific necessity. I mean, he dealt with something so specific to his time. Obviously, dealing with Super Mario today is somehow outdated, except of maybe bringing it in relation to queer studies, to kind of like make a relation to the history of computer games in that sense. But I think it's about like understanding how he perceived his environment and how he translated this perception, because that's mainly the thing. It's not about Donkey Kong or kind of cool sneakers, really. It's much more about a kind of like, and that's always social, politically interesting. You don't have to be a political artist, a protester, to be political artists. Making no political statement is a political statement. So every art as such is already political, because art is always the first thing that disappears in a dictatorship. So it's the kind of like most extreme form of freedom and liberation somehow. And then it's about like finding this, I guess, very specific narrow angle, but like, I guess there's no recipe.
Thank you. There is another question.
Hello, thank you for your thoughts and your speech. It was amazing, I really liked it. And yeah, I just wanted to add some things. As a Luxembourgish artist, I'm 27 years old, finishing my master now in Basel. And so I just wanted to add something about the impact on Luxembourgish artists. So me as 27-year-old, I didn't know Michel Majerus personally, but I think I know a bit about his work, even more today. And I just wanted to say that for Luxembourg, so a country where life turns around buying houses, cars, clothing, and investing money to get more of it, I think that Michel Majerus, even though he denied a bit his origin country, I think that he reflected it a lot in his work. So he worked with hypercapitalism, and yeah, the most important thing is he allowed Luxembourgish people or Luxembourgish artists to dream. He was the first one who was big in internationally speaking. He had his work outside of Luxembourg, and it's something I think that a lot of young people in Luxembourg dream about now. So I think that he's a very good example for young Luxembourgish artists, and also young Luxembourgish artists who made it. And then I wanted to talk about, or I want also to ask you why Michel Majerus is still important in the art world. And so my personal thoughts are that first of all, he worked with media that are still there now, and he had not the chance to be sellout. I say not the chance because of his death, of course, and yeah, so a lot of French rappers say j'ai peur de faire l'album de trop. So the album that is too much. He didn't do this album that is too much. He was on his peak, or not even on his peak. And another thing that I wanted to say is that you talked about he placed Mario on his paintings, the Mario that is controlled by the player. So the Mario and the player has changed. So technology is kind of controlling human beings today with algorithms and things like that, social media. So the player becomes Mario. And I would have really liked to see Michel Majerus work today with social media, because I think he would do a very good job. So I wanted to know, why is Michel Majerus still important for you?
Thank you. Well, I mean, I think in general there's not many artists that are like not alive anymore today that still have a relevance for a contemporary discourse, but then it also changes. from time to time because times change. And as I tried maybe to say earlier, I think the relevance today is that on one hand side, I think he wouldn't engage with social media today because it's not, social media today is not the same thing like Super Mario back then. Super Mario was a like subculture and a very kind of like visually dominant subculture. Social media is not a subculture. It's a way of manipulating public elections. It's a tool, it's a media outlet, it's a way of self-representation. It's like everything, it's so dominant. It's like not, I'm not sure if he would specifically be interested in it. A guess, super wild guess. But I think the kind of like the way he kind of like managed to perceive little details in his surrounding that only also look now so absolutely kind of like visible is the quality. Because also, like imagine Berlin post-reunification, it's not a colorful city. It's like gray, cold, mostly destroyed and unrenovated. There's no kind of like oat milk coffee shops. It's a completely kind of like devastated city, but it was empty. So there was space to do something. And the space was sometimes filled with a television that showed MTV or Viva 2. So that's the way images were created. And then sometimes slowly you had neon signs, LED signs, and so on. But before that, it wasn't really there. So back then it wasn't colorful, but his paintings are colorful. And I think there's an interesting shift or like also division within. And the rest was the work of Charlotte Posenenske, completely different practice, different style, different life. She's also not alive anymore, maybe the only link, and they're both German. Not. She stopped making art at a certain point because she didn't believe that art can contribute to any social change. That's why she stopped making it, and then she died much too early. But her work, if you would look into it now, like the manifest she wrote, the performances she made, the way she dealt with serial production, aesthetics, surface, minimalism, it's so radical, even in today's context of art production, that it's still relevant, even though it's like almost 50 years old.
I had a question about the means of his productions, because he seems to have produced a lot of pieces, and some of them are very huge. And because of what you said about how he was working all the time, I was wondering if he had like a really big studio and assistants, or he was really working alone and just doing it all by himself. I don't know if you have.
Maybe I have to say that I'm not a Michel Majerus expert, but he had he had assistants. There's a documentation. I'm not sure if that's released soon. He had assistants. He was very specific with colors. They mixed colors on very specific scales. The studio was big but not huge. Like industrial style studio, working with stencils, colors, pencils, everything.
Thank you. Thank you, Fabian. Okay, so I see that Corey is already here. I don't know where to look. So I'm going to introduce you, Corey, before your lecture performance. Corey Archangel is an artist, composer, curator, and entrepreneur living and working in Stavanger in Norway. Corey Archangel explores the potential and failures of old and new technologies, highlighting their obsolescence, humor, aesthetic attributes, and at times, eerie influence in contemporary life. Applying a semi-archaeological methodology, his practice explores, encodes, and hacks the structural language of video games, software, social media, and machine learning, treating them as subject matter and medium. His work has been exhibited in many solo exhibitions, notably at the Whitney Museum in New York, at the Carnegie Museum of Art in Pittsburgh, at the Barbican Art Center in London, or at the Hamburger Bahnhof in Berlin, among others. Hey, Corey, you can start.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. All right. Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. And thanks for having me. Thanks to Madame and to the estate. I'm very excited to be here. I guess be here as in quotations. And this, I'm excited that this is the inauguration of my streaming setup. So what I'm gonna do today is something called Burned Out. And it is a kind of parallel presentation to the essay I wrote for the Michel Majerus catalog, which is called Michel Majerus, published by DCV in Berlin. I don't know if it's out yet. Maybe it's already out. So that's a kind of polished New Yorker style long read. And this is going to be covering some of the same ideas, but well, I'm here. So it'll be kind of in my own words and a bit more rambling and unorganized. And so I hope that the two things together could be nice, a nice pair. And yeah, I think we said lecture performance because we didn't really know what this was going to be. It's not really exactly a lecture. It's not really exactly a performance. So, okay. And the other important thing that I want to say is that this lecture or performance or whatever it is has an arena accompaniment. I've lived in Norway for so long. I'm losing my English. It is accompanied by an arena channel. So for those of you who don't know, arena is a kind of artist founded and run social network for organizing thoughts, videos, ideas. It's kind of like ambient Pinterest or a friendly, whatever social network you use, it's a friendly version. And I'm a power user. And so what I've done is I've put together an arena channel here for those who want to look at some of this material afterwards. And let me just share my screen now. And you could see it is there. Okay, so the channel is organized backwards. So the actual lecture starts at the bottom of the channel and I'll work my way up. And these are just links to things that I had seen around the web that I want to talk about. So each of these links to a kind of broader resource. Okay, so I'm gonna try to do this in like 25 minutes-ish. So just bear with me, it's gonna be pretty quick. Here we go. So I wanted to start with, well, you know what? I hated Majerus's work when I first saw it. I mean, I really, really, really hated his work. I first saw his work in 2002 in a show that he did at Friedrich Petzl Gallery in New York. I would have been 24 years old at the time. And I will tell you how I remember it. And then later in this thing, I will kind of tell you probably what actually happened, because after doing a lot of research about this show, I realized I was remembering it totally wrong. But what I remember was walking into the gallery, which at that time was on 22nd Street in Chelsea. And I remember walking in, and I remembered almost immediately, like, if those of you who remember Petzl Gallery at the time, it was a kind of long hallway and there was a front desk on the left side. And I remember just almost immediately after the front desk see a giant black painting with Space Invaders on it, probably this or another one. And I just remember seeing it. I remember getting so angry, and I just remember turning right around and just leaving the gallery. Didn't remember the name of the artist, didn't just absolutely just got so annoyed, and I just left. some background is probably in order. I was 24. I had just graduated from music conservatory 2 years earlier with a degree in kind of electronic music, kind of avant-garde music. I studied as a composer, and I didn't have any contemporary art knowledge or experience yet. I had, though, started to kind of creep around galleries. And I think I could explain, there's probably three main reasons why I got so annoyed. One thing is to note is that in the early 2000s, New York City had an amazing net art scene. And Rhizome defines net art as art that acts on the network or is acted upon it. I think that's like a really lovely definition. Although I think even the scene at New York was even a little bit beyond that. It was kind of net art, digital art. There was a couple organizations around then that were around. So Thing, Wolfgang Stahle's, the Thing was a kind of, at the time I knew it as an email list where people discussed contemporary art. It was also an internet service provider. And Wolfgang Stahle, who founded it, is also an artist, and I'll talk about one of his works a little later. There was, this actually, Rhizome has reconstructed some of the early Thing bulletin board systems messages. So for those interested at home who want to do more research, that's there. There was rhizome.org, which is, started as a kind of platform also for communication about digital art. And there was also the Upgrade. I don't know if people remember this. This was Yael Kanarek's kind of get these kind of, it was monthly meetings where digital artists would talk about their work. So digital artists didn't have a lot of exhibition opportunities at the time. So often there were these structures where people could come together and talk about their work. Now, the reason I talk about all this is because of this kind of amazing scene. I was, almost on a monthly basis, just had the opportunity to see these amazing masterpiece artworks. And so I was seeing all these digital artworks at the time. So let me give you like three quick examples. One would be, I saw this work, Every Shot, Every Episode, in 2001 by Jennifer and Kevin McCoy. This is Jennifer and Kevin had taken the show Starsky and Hutch and kind of ran it, all the scenes through a database and re-edited it into all these different videos. So for example, one video would be every mirror from the whole television show. Another scene would be every cough, or another video would be every cough or every boss. And so what you had is this kind of incredible installation where you had all these video discs. You could pull one out and you could put it in a player and you could see these kind of edits. So this is an amazing work. I saw Wolfgang Stahle's Untitled. So I would actually talk about the whole series that Wolfgang Stahle did of webcam works, where he would train a webcam on a certain location and project those webcams in gallery spaces. And these webcams would update every like 3 to 5 seconds. And they really they read as like monumental, they read as paintings, and also I would say like kind of Warholian. This particular show, which I saw, was the front room was the Lower Manhattan as videotaped from Brooklyn. And then in the back of the gallery was the Comberg Monastery in Germany as videoed or as recorded by a webcam. So these were, I should say that these were live. So you'd go into the gallery and you'd see these spaces live. And of course, this particular one, Untitled, was up during the 9/11 attack, and so this artwork also happened to record the whole attack. And I saw it at the end of the show, and so at the time you could still see the smoke from fires that were burning. And there's a third work that I want to talk about, which I couldn't find any record of, but it's by Mark Napier. I don't know the title, but he had made a web page and it just showed blank white. And when you clicked on it, it made ripples as if a pond. And if anyone anywhere else in the world saw that web page, they would see those ripples. And if they clicked, they would make ripples and they would combine. So it was this amazing, distributed, very simple, very beautiful web performance. So I mentioned these three works or series of works because I just had no time in 2002 for painting. I could not understand why anyone would be painting then when all of this other stuff was happening. The second thing is that galleries had in New York City started to move from Soho. And I'm going to click here on a really great book called Soho So Long by the Art Club 2000, who were mentioned a little bit earlier. This is a really great kind of book of interviews with gallerists and other people adjacent to the art industry about why the galleries moved from Soho to Chelsea. And in that move, the kind of modern gallery was born, the modern gallery being a kind of big industrial space. And also, it was already mentioned earlier how big galleries have gotten. This had started in the mid-90s. And so when I saw a Petzl gallery in 2002, one of these galleries is what I walked into, small by today's standards, but then still, it just seemed enormous, smooth concrete floor. And having no experience with the art industry, I was like, these spaces just radiate money, power, market, inaccessibility. You don't really feel even like you're welcome in spaces like that. So that was also kind of weighing in on me. And then the third thing which annoyed me was I was making digital work at the time. I was making work using video game systems. And this work was just seen as kind of second rate. It wasn't considered real artwork, or it was, well, the best example I have of that is there were spaces to show media work in the early 2000s, but often they were, well, here's an example. This would be the New Museum's Zenith Media Lounge, which I should admit I was very happy to show in, but it was, in the basement and under the stairs. And many institutions had these kind of spaces, and they were always like literally under stairs, in the basement, around the corner. They were secondary spaces as digital work just wasn't considered a real valid kind of pursuit in the kind of larger art industry at the time. And so when I went into Majerus' show and saw this painting of Space Invaders, and I just thought, well, why should a painter get these beautiful spaces? Why can't digital artists get these beautiful spaces? I want these beautiful spaces. So all these things were kind of mixed up, and I was also 24. So anyway, so as I mentioned, I didn't bother to even, find the name of the artist who made these Space Invader paintings. So what I want to talk about now is how Majerus came back into my life, kind of quote unquote, as an adult. And he came back in my life in 2004. And before I get to how, I just want to talk about some of the real basic things that had changed. So first we could talk about what changed for me is I kept hanging around galleries, and I kept, being annoyed by galleries, but I kept going because in that annoyance, there was something that it really meant that I wanted these things. And so, slowly I learned about, photography. So I learned how to make photographs. I learned how, the language of sculpture. And so I had spent kind of 10 years, like slowly teaching myself the basic language of contemporary art. And this, in some years, this was difficult. So, Mike Smith, who is learning who Mike Smith was for many years, I put him as an example here. There was the place where I worked had a picture of him in a video on a horse with a cowboy hat. And for many years, I could not get Mike Smith and Richard Prince straight, because I thought, oh, right, the guy on the horse, the guy with the horse that is Mike Smith. But anyway, over many, many years, I eventually figured out Mike Smith, Roberta Smith, Mike Kelly. And then the other thing that happens is, of course, the world changes. So, you know, Google happens. In fact, Google, I would say, became mainstream because Google, I think, started in the late 90s. Google was first introduced to me by a computer science friend in college, I think 99. But Google becomes mainstream. Facebook happens, if you could believe it. YouTube happens. And of course, Instagram happens. So these are all the things that are happening in the background. So in 2000, and actually just a real quick side note, also in 2014, Kevin McCoy does a presentation where he, this is Kevin McCoy from the earlier masterpiece I showed you. He does a presentation where he kind of proposes the technology of NFTs. So, and he called it Monograph. So that's a kind of side note, which is interesting. So 2014, I'm on Instagram and I see this image. In fact, I literally see this, and it's I have my same phone here. This is New Waste, who was actually Gil Gentili, who was a production assistant of mine at the time. And I want to talk a little bit about Gil. Gil was my production assistant, and this isn't just any post on Instagram. Gil had great visual taste. I liked Gil's visual taste so much that I asked him to design my book, which is called The Source. Here, you could see it here, and you could see Gil's amazing cover. So this is a book of source code, and yet Gil presented this cover to me, and this shows you. So Gil has a really great visual sense, visual taste, and so I'm paying attention to Gil's Instagram because I know he kind of knows what he's looking at. So he posts this, and I don't know who it is. There's no name, there's no artist, there's nothing, and I immediately get very tense because I'm presented with something that I almost immediately know is a masterpiece, yet I don't know anything about it. So immediately my Rolodex in my head starts flipping, and I try to figure out, oh God, who is that? What artist did this? And quickly I want to take you through some of the people that I thought it could be. So I thought maybe at first it could be Jeff Elrod. So this is Jeff Elrod, an amazing painter. This is a show Jeff Elrod did in New York in 2002 with Leo Koenig, which actually I was hanging around Leo Koenig during these years because I worked around the corner, and I saw this show being installed, and I saw Jeff actually pull the tape off of these black paintings. But it didn't quite seem to be a Jeff Elrod, but it was close. So then I thought, well, maybe it could be a Wendy White. Here are some Wendy White paintings from those years. She's another super, super, super painter. But it didn't quite line up. There was something more harsh about the Majerus. So then I thought, well, maybe it could be a Francis Reuter. And the palette, you could see here, the palette I thought lined up with Francis Reuter, but the imagery didn't quite line up with Francis. And then my last guess was it could be a Laura Owens painting maybe. And during those years, people had started whispering about this Laura Owens series of paintings. I hadn't seen them yet, but people were whispering, she's got this new series of paintings. They're very cool. They're kind of Tumblr style. They're massive. So I thought maybe it could be Laura Owens, but similar to some of the other artists, this painting by Majerus, this untitled painting, was just too, here's the post. And then here it is on the Matthew Marks website. The Majerus painting is just too dystopic. So eventually what I thought is I thought, oh, this is probably some young Berlin artist. That was kind of where I landed on this. some young kind of post-internet artist who I was worried about because I thought this was the most amazing painting. So let me briefly talk about this painting, and then I want to just kind of come back to why I like these Space Invader paintings now. But quickly, like, you know, so when I see this painting, what do I think of? For me, there's just so many elements in the painting we could talk about. I could just zoom in on one thing, which would be maybe the phrase newcomer. And for me, what that, you know, reminds me of is, here, let me get these tabs. You know, I'm just the generation after. And so I remember like life before the internet. And I think that it's already been discussed a few times in this symposium that it's important to remember that the internet really hadn't happened yet. It existed, but it hadn't become mainstream yet. And so I kind of remember this life before the internet. And so when I see these, you know, these kind of techno fonts, I immediately kind of zoom back into, for me, it was this store, Sonic Groove. This was the store I used to hang out in on Bleecker Street. This was the techno store run by Adam X and Heather Hart. I have a link to Heather Hart on my arena if anyone wants to see. So it's Heather Hart, 1999, who you could see often working in Sonic Groove. And I just remember being in these aisles and being dazzled by these record covers in this strange language and these strange colors. And I have a couple examples here from this project here called the AUD MCR's Underground Dance Music Collection of Recorded Sound. This is a collection of trance records I bought from a retired trance DJ. I bought his entire collection and cataloged it as is without even changing the order of the records. And I think it's a really good, or it has been for me, a really good resource when researching Majerus, because you can kind of see actually what trance records looked like at the time. And so there are a couple in here that seem to me like very Majerus-y. So for me, just that one phrase, burned out, just all of a sudden sends me down this spiral of all these different connections. And for him, for me, the thing with Majerus is there's like 40 of those things in one painting. And so it's, here's some other kind of really great record covers that I find have a kind of feeling of Majerus. Although I think something that is interesting, if someone were to go in a little bit farther, if you actually look at what all of trance records look like, they're not, they don't all look like what we think trance records would look like. In fact, a lot of them don't. So here's like an example of this record label called Renaissance Records. So it's interesting that Majerus, we associate him with this kind of look of the time, but actually it is a selective look. It's a look of the time of what is only new in the time. So this is a great kind of interesting other type of trance record look. So now what I want to do is, so I find out at Majerus, I think it's some young artist. I eventually corner Gil, and Gil's like, oh, no, that's an artist named Michel Majerus. Yeah, I forgot this part of the story. This is from 14 years ago, and I completely was blown away and started then kind of creeping around the estate and trying, you know, I kind of sought out the estate, and I just said, I have to learn as much as I can about this artist. There's so much energy coming on here. And then on one of those trips to the estate, paging through the catalog, I saw the Space Invader, or one of the Space Invader paintings again, and was really, really surprised and remembered my initial encounter with Majerus and was kind of blown away. And actually what had happened is there were 2 Space Invader paintings in the show. I had remembered them as one. And also when I was paging through the catalog at the estate, I realized I did actually see the rest of the show, because I had seen the Cornhead painting. When I saw an image of that, I remembered, oh yeah, I did see that. And I do remember looking around the corner in the show, seeing that giant installation and just being like, whoa. So what I want to talk about now in kind of conclusion is to think, well, why do I like Majerus now, love Majerus? Or, you know what I mean? Why is he in a kind of eternal inspiration to me now? And why did I dislike it so much then? And so a couple things, like, first is like, in the meantime, I came to a kind of understanding of painting, and my understanding of painting came to me through the world of heavy metal. So my brother works in the heavy metal industry, and that's an industry that I have a lot of respect for and kind of grew up with my whole life, with my brother kind of teaching. He's my older brother, teaching me the kind of ins and outs. And heavy metal is, I think, a great way to think about painting. It is an industry, and it is an industry unto itself. It is an industry which has its own history and its own timeline, and it operates completely without any interference from other music industries. It is totally insular, and it just keeps plugging away. And young metal bands are expected to have a kind of knowledge of the whole history. So if you're a young metal band and you don't know all the history going back to the beginning, it's actually kind of very strange. So most bands have this kind of reverence for the history of metal, and even though, of course, they might want to just be trying to move it forward or destroy it or whatever. And so I think it's a lot, for me, it helped understand painting, that painting is this kind of, painting is its own thing, and it just goes forward. It can be mainstream, but it can also, but actually its own dialogue is kind of outside of other art dialogues, and it just kind of does its own thing. And painters have a knowledge of painting going back hundreds of years, and they're all just trying to chip away and just make some contribution. And so on my arena here, I won't punish you with, but I have a kind of like a timeline between Black Sabbath to Pentagram to Sleep to Earth. So you could hear this kind of, this is just one thread of heavy metal where you could hear Black Sabbath and all these bands that came after. So painting, I kind of came to an understanding of painting, and that painting is kind of amazing. The second thing is I came to understand the art world as how it relates to power. And there was, somebody had mentioned earlier, the art world became hyper about the market and power. And so then thinking back on, why I didn't like Chelsea galleries at the time is I didn't understand that gross feeling of, these kind of blue chip galleries. And what I didn't understand, especially with Majerus, is that Majerus is working with that energy. And so when you see, when you see these Majerus paintings and they're installed in these spaces, Majerus knows about, blue chip painters, money, auctions. You could see it in his diaries. He's completely aware, and he is trying to insert himself in there and use that kind of tension to the artwork's advantage. And so that's something that completely I had no concept of when I saw that show. And then, the third thing is what I thought I was seeing with these. Sorry, I'm like, I forgot to. Here's Cornhead. I forgot to click. What I thought I was seeing with when I saw these Space Invaders paintings, I thought I was, what I interpreted as is like some German painter was trying to be cool by painting Space Invaders. But what it really is, I think, is Majerus painting Space Invaders in the style of Warhol, or silk screening, I should say, silk screening as painting, of course, in the style of Warhol, and then not to be like a painting by Majerus, or not to be a painting by an artist, but it is then to be, quote unquote, a painting by Majerus. So it is totally aware that this is a painting to be installed in Petzl, to be a painting by Majerus, which is using the style of another artist, and to use that kind of tension of these blue chip spaces and the whole history of, you know, contemporary painting and auctions, to use it all as an advantage. And so in that way, like it's you know, Majerus isn't making paintings, he's more making these kind of like performances or things which are to perform as painting by Majerus. And so this stuff all flew over my head when I was 24, but this is kind of how I see the work now. It's he's a kind of meta artist in a way. And I also link to these as, I would say that perhaps these could be, you know, Stella's in pastels. You could imagine him writing in his diaries. So he's always trying to do these combinations and using other artists as his material. And so then I just want to talk, like, just to leave you, like, I think it was also important that I saw this untitled painting on Instagram. And I think it's important that meaning like I saw it today, and meaning like it's how it came through Instagram to me. And it's what it's next to on Instagram. And, you know, on Instagram, it's next to, you know, oil companies, heads of states, disinformation bots. And so I think his work has a particular resonance now because this kind of internet utopia had kind of completely fallen apart and has turned into a kind of dystopia. And I read his work as like totally, absolutely dystopic and harsh. And here are some, I've posted some just kind of some current examples of dystopic images, and these are from the really great Open Arena channel, Yuppie Dystopia. So it's an arena channel for people to post things which are about the current dystopia that we live in. And so yeah, I think that's kind of how, and then of course, if you want to watch this Facebook metaverse video, this is exactly the dystopia that I'm thinking of. So I think his work works especially well now, as the world kind of heats up and decline and all. Yeah, I don't know how to say, but we're on the verge of climate collapse. So I mean, I think his work is so harsh and so dystopic that it has a way of meaning more now. And so I did want to just leave with the phrases in that painting, which is, you know, these phrases: burned out, newcomer, plant explosive device, the means of deception, zero, fuck the intention of the artist. And so I think these are really great. You know, these are not positive phrases. These are really tense and difficult things. And I think for me, that's really what why the work resonates for me right now. Okay, I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Corey. I think it was also very interesting to have this way of showing your influences on this platform arena, which also reminded of Majerus's way of working in collecting visual material. So it's also a nice nod to Majerus's way of working. Also, I like the heavy metal reference, and I think Tofik, our IT technician, probably loved it because he's really into it. But I actually wanted to ask you a very simple question. How this rediscovery of Majerus's work actually influenced your reflections and your work in the end?
Yeah, oh, it's a great question. Wow, that's such a wild question. I mean, well, I have a great answer. I mean, on Friday I'm opening a show at the Kunstverein in Hamburg, and it's literally below the Majerus show, which also opens on the same day. And in putting together that show, I was like, oh my God, like I have to compete against, like it was so competing with Majerus, or at least pulling myself up to the same level, was the almost impossible goal of putting together that show. And so that's a kind of like very recent example, just, you know, and it affected the works that I was choosing. It affected how I installed it. It affected how I talked about it. You know, it's a really, really, really high bar. And as people had mentioned, he had this kind of like, he was so on, and he hadn't even really peaked yet. And it seemed almost magical how he was doing it, right? And I, of course, am like, I'm living and I'm middle-aged. I mean, to even try to get close to that zone that he was in was really daunting. And I mean, you could even see in my studio here, I mean, these are like, can you see these pink things? These are like,
Yes.
so these are like really, these are powder coating on aluminum, and clearly I'm thinking about Majerus when I'm making these. And so I'm just trying to, so it changed everything, you know. And of course, aluminum, even literally aluminum, is a Majerus medium, you know. So a lot of different ways. And then also to have been around the estate and to have to work with the estate to that also has been amazing to see, you know, how gentle and how cared for the works are. And it's been inspiring in a whole different way, you know.
Thanks. Anyone in the audience would like to ask a question or make a comment? Nope. Okay. So we're running a bit late, so maybe we end it here for now, and we will see you again, Corey, at the panel discussion. Thank you so much. It was great. So now we're going to take another little break, and there is another little surprise, so please wait.
2, 3.
Tu me fais juste un 1, 2, 3, 4 et je règle juste le gain. Comme ça, je suis tranquille, micro par micro.
Je fais comme ça, 1, 2, 3, 4. Comme ça, tu peux régler les gars. Comme un cowboy, dans les poches.
Voilà, poche revolver.
Évidemment, c'est bon, c'est poche. Là.
2 mains et 2 poches.
On fait 1, 2, 3, 4, ok?
Ouais, ça va.
1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Deux, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 2.
I hope you had a nice lunch break. Welcome back. I hope you had a nice lunch break. Welcome back. So we're going to
especially in this situation also as well. It's super nice. Exactly, that someone gives the knowledge also. It's so great, someone gives you the knowledge. I thought it was like very, but I thought it was more personal. Everyone has a very personal take on such a short body of work, but usually it's a bit like, I don't know, repeating what's in the book already. So it was more in the we all look at the same word, more or less. Like yes, yeah. But we all said different things about them. But very different angles. It's interesting that the word wouldn't allow that much different kinds of reading. But I think like probably like the person said, you know, like the question of the person who said you have to do like the last album. Yeah. But I guess it's also because it's so short that it's super intriguing and we need to just go beyond, you know, like if someone lives 100 years, you have to always deal with chronological and yes, and this and that. I know it's so short that you actually really have your own personal interpretation. Yeah.
Okay. Now the last part of this conversation conference today. At first, a big, big thank you to all of you. It was so interesting and it was such a good mix. And it really showed quite some facets of the work of Michel Majerus. And I mean this, Cory, you are here, right?
I am here. I am here. I've chosen not to be 10 feet behind you, so I will just be here in audio.
Oh,
okay?
It's good. It's a bit like God watching from here.
Yeah.
But good. I just wanted to know before, you know. So it was... I would like, with this last panel, I would like to wrap it up a bit. And I would also like then open it to the audience for last questions. And since Motoko, I'm going to start with you because we didn't have any questions for you and the Q&A. What I found interesting, I thought about Michel and also Japanese cultural history when I saw the show at the estate with Murakami and Majerus, curated by Tobias Berge from Hong Kong. And I was really interested because for the first time I realized it, and I knew that Murakami also didn't know Michel very much. Could you tell us a bit about your approach towards his work?
To Murakami?
Majerus.
Majerus. So I went to Slate and painting, and I just discovered Majerus's work. I go really into it, and it's for me like in the talks we kind of talked about like it's not somehow outdated, and still you can kind of have this like conversation like like now, like his styles and like like the way of using images and so on. So I just kind of really, when I was like doing BA, I was really inspired. Like really, painting can be anything, like open, pop, fun.
And your performance, also the two performances you showed here today?
Yes.
How do you connect it?
How do I connect it?
Yeah.
So I thought that he used like a Mario Kart or these pop images, which I think the way that I thought his style was new back then or like unusual or something, but I felt the character or the way he used or the character themselves were already probably nostalgic for him as well, like probably this rabbit or Mario, these like maybe he wasn't maybe like that, I don't know. I think he had a mixture of like iconologies back then, but also like his more older date, like this like a table game kind of like symbol. So I thought for me this karaoke is kind of always like a nostalgic thing.
And also, this is also a question to Cory from an artistic practice. I mean, we talked a lot about performance today. And you both, I mean, you did a performance. Cory, I think you called it lecture performance. I mean, what makes the performance aspect of Michel's work interesting? Or is it rather the painting? I mean, I find him utterly performative.
Yeah, I agree. I also think that the work works on a performative meta level. I don't think of him as a painter really at all. I'm not even sure. I think installation artist is also maybe a bit too limiting, but I think that he's performing as Majerus, as he's I don't want to say as a character because that's not quite it, but he's really aware of what it means to be a painter and to have a name. And I mean painter in quotes, but to be a painter, to have a name and move through the art industry. He's so aware of it that you could argue it is a performance, although when you start using the word performance, people clearly, you have to kind of qualify it because people think someone's standing around doing something in the gallery. Oh, okay. I will say over and out when I'm done.
Do you also have an answer to this, or was it for you more the painting aspect of his work?
Not painting, but more like how digital or the way like the images or techniques he used were. My question, like all the time, like when I look at his works, like how, I don't know, like new it was or like.
And do you see a connection to Murakami?
Some parts of it, yes, the way, like a flat images. And yeah, but Murakami's more, I think, pushed the anime kind of side, like, yeah. But I think Majerus are more like connected to history of painting and the like styles of like abstraction, expressionism, like Polk and stuff. Like
yeah, I mean, he's really in between. I see him also as a type of an artist that is now completely contemporary and there. And he started, I mean, coming from the painterly 80s in a way in Germany, and then changing something in his own practice. But when we talk about, or having a panel like this, it's also about history building in the end. I mean, we all the time do it. And the most effective is 100 years after an artist died, in a way, because that's the easiest. Then you see the big picture, and we are trying it also here today. Also with the talks, there was a lot of thinking about what he would mean today or what he meant in a way. So, can I ask a question about the relevance today of Majerus? Is there somebody who wants to answer? I mean, you answered this already. And I think Cory also answered it in a way. Is there something that can be made of use for today's art practice, for today's curatorial practice, is really, really important in a way?
I guess I can take that one. I also wanted to just start by saying that I personally don't find Majerus' work as performance. I think it's performative, but I don't think it's performance. And as someone who works with performance, I think that the use of the body in performance practices comes with its own history and is incredibly important as a history unto itself. So curatorially, I would make a distinction between that being a performative painter or performative artist, but I don't see this as being performance myself. I know that Bart van de Heide, for example, has written about his performative character, and Corey has spoken about that, but I would politely disagree. But in terms of his relevance today, I think that what's been a little bit the elephant in the room that Fabian kind of, talked about, and this gentleman in the back that's the Luxembourgian artist. There was also someone who was asking, okay, but like, what's the political merit of the work today? And it kind of feels like there's a ticket to entry in the art world right now in terms of it needing to be political. And I think that begs the question, what is political art and what is it doing and why? And I think that what is really interesting about Majerus is that his politics is embodied. It's not something that he's making a declarative confrontational statement about many things, but he has a politics that is kind of existing within the kind of body of his work. It's in his production practices. And I think that that's interesting to look at. I think that that's a huge discussion point right now of how do we look at works like this? How do we look at someone who has also a very internal practice, an internal logic, one that's, looking at sometimes problematic history of a very male-dominated history as well. But how do we make sense of that? And also, is there room in an industry for this kind of work that doesn't necessarily have a very clear political stakes when we need to make so much progress on a social front? So yeah, I see it as a huge discussion point. And I guess I would push back on the idea that his work has to be contextualized within, the sphere of politics.
Fabian, do you want to add on this? I mean, you also started the discussion on politics in his work.
Is that working? Hello? Can you hear me? No. Thank you. I think it's interesting what when Corey talked about the perception of the work, or like his very kind of personal approach to the work, and then we looked at this one favorite painting of his with all the text elements, amongst others, Burnout. I think there's an element in it which often is perceived as like cool statements, but like then this is an aspect that I find super interesting if you would like dig deeper into this meaning of the actual words used, and this I find it. I know what you mean with there is this kind of like need in the art world today that everything needs to be political somehow to enter, but then this kind of curiosity that he had in looking around, adapting, using, mixing, trashing it, reusing it, and again, I think this kind of curiosity is something that I find highly political on one hand side, but then also just human in nature. I think that's the relevance.
I mean, it's interesting. Tim Neuger just pointed it out that, it's political and non-political. It's, now I forgot about the best part you said. It's performative and it's not performative. It's painting and it's discussing painting in a certain way. So, it's both. There is a certain complexity without choosing the direct paths, but also accepting and respecting the complexity of it in a way.
And maybe to add to that, and to also like this performance discussion we had here, I'm also not necessarily thinking there is this kind of like performance within the work, but like if you would look into the history of performance art as such and just use the term of performance as something that kind of like opens up a very kind of stuck art world. In the 70s, 80s, performance was the medium that kind of like brought together suddenly all kind of different areas, from the visual arts, from dance, from music, from literature, and so on, in a kind of radical manner. And this kind of like, if you use that term to apply it to Majerus, then I think there is this performativity based on that idea of mixing suddenly visual languages from all over the place.
There's another question that popped up the whole time, and now I remember what else he said. It was, on the one side it is dystopian, if you really look at the language, and on the other side it's extremely light. And I never had this dystopian, I never saw this dystopian aspect in the work so much. But Corey, maybe you want to say something about this?
Yeah, it's excuse me. It's interesting because I had exactly the opposite. I never saw the work as light at all, and it's only today that that was mentioned. There was a kind of light criticality in one of the presentations, and so it's only today that I've even been introduced that his work is light. I mean, maybe, And why is that? I mean, maybe it's because my in was the later work, you know, and that is the work that I actually saw. But I mean, just the phrases in that painting, you know, the means of deception. There's something about detonation. I mean, we're really talking about explosives, you know, deception, war, fire. So yeah, I'm very thankful for this day today, because now I have to revisit everything and think, well, maybe I'm not even seeing a whole half here, you know. Over and out.
I always thought his works were light to me, but I don't know, like it was for me, like when I saw his work at the first time, it was like, this is really so accessible, so familiar, because of images, cartoons, like more feel like, I mean, you feel the vibe of 90s or something, but like you still like feel like, my generation's kind of painting, like, you know, grew up with games and things like that. So, yeah.
If I may just add to that, because I think it's very interesting that you say you felt very familiar with it. I myself had to Google image reverse search some of the pictorial elements, because I first thought I would recognize them as, we said often, like techno font or something like that, but I didn't actually know where it comes from. I didn't really know what it was, and it was quite a bit of forensic work from my side to retrace it. And I found that was actually interesting to see how there's this, and that's why I brought up this term of the cultural unconscious. There's this feeling that we are familiar with something like the Busy Bear or the Super Mario or whatever, and we have it looks friendly, but then there's also a sinister side to it. So I do definitely see what Corey mentioned. I think the ambiguity is very much there. It's like there's multiple levels of alienation, but also being alienated from something that you're sort of enclosed in, right? Or that you're immersed in. And I think that's something that the work really, it crystallizes in the work.
Yeah, I would say actually I feel like it's the works are all like a mirror, and it's really, I think it's really not so much a layer where you would go into depth and analyze certain strata of images, but I think their relevance and also why they can feel this topic, it's exactly how you are looking at them that is sent back to you. And I feel because of this cultural unconscious aspect, maybe it is why it is so present, but not in a light way, in a way that if your time is a dark one, you are going to see that directly, and you are going to have your guard down because you think it's something eternal, it's something light, it's something pop, it's something universal. So you are not really going to see an image that is connotating, oh, this is this and this reality I'm living in, or this is political art. And I think the fact that it's not showing that it's either political or light or speaking about this or that, it is this moment when you have your guard down, then actually if you are living in an optimistic time, if you yourself have this vision of the world, this is what you are going to see. And I think for me it was something that became very clear when we were all doing our presentations, because I felt they were all very much more personal than what you would usually have at this kind of symposium. And I guess it's really, you are just, it's like a mirror held up to everyone and every time.
Yeah, I think this is a very, very good point, because also today I looked at all the presentations and I had this feeling of really Berlin, also a mirror of Berlin of the time, and it was political and it was light and it was techno. And I found so many things I wasn't aware about, but it felt like a completely familiarity with what was happening at that time there. And it's really, I agree. It is a certain mirror of something that is, that speaks to many people like on a very, very personal level.
I keep thinking about the fact that I find Majerus' work quite reticent. Like as a maker, I think that I know that's like $1 million English word. It means like hesitant to speak. And I also find it to some extent, him as a maker, quite anonymous. And I'm wondering, we haven't really talked about authorship and his relationship to authorship. And we've talked a lot about this idea of sampling and how he acts almost as like a filter. And I wonder if that's an intentional strategy that he has to kind of remove himself as a kind of, in this very German painterly male way, to remove himself as this kind of character as a maker, and to use more of this kind of function as almost like a sieve within his work. But I don't know, I mean, I also talked to, Tim a little bit about the fact that he was quite an introverted person. The talks that I've seen him give that are on YouTube, he seems like very hesitant to make these kind of grand pronouncements, and that all of that thinking was in this the format of these notebooks, which are so incredibly crucial to understanding his thinking and his work. But yeah, I guess authorship really popped up for me in terms of thinking through his kind of methodologies and strategies, just as we've been talking right now.
Can I pass this question on to Corey, maybe? I mean, I refer also to your presentation and the mix of different references you brought into this presentation.
Corey's really the person who made me think about this, because it's also within his presentation. Corey, you were talking about how he, would appropriate the styles and also even like directly the work, right, of like Warhol and Basquiat, and that takes quite a really unique personality to be able to just, it's very like cheeky on one hand, and it's also very, you have to really kind of not have an oversized ego to be able to do that. But yeah, I'd be curious to hear Corey's thoughts on that as well.
I mean, yeah, I agree with it's wild. I mean, I think some of the things he did are absolutely to have. I mean, I could speak from my own experience as an artist. There's a like if I were to try to do some of the things that he did, I would feel almost ill. Like trying, like the day of the opening, I would feel kind of sick in a way, because they're so nervy, and they require such an amount of confidence, right? And it's mystifying to me that he was able to do some of these things, like the Warhol Basquiat thing with the lines. I mean, it's nervy, it's intense, and it does make sense to me that he had a kind of rich introvert life, because I think otherwise it just seems hard to imagine. In terms of authorship, I mean, it's hard. I don't have a great take on it other than during those years in symposiums like this, which I was had started to get invited to, there was always this idea of the remix, which kind of always drove me nuts. Like everything was a remix, everything was mixing. So the only thing that I would say is it might be interesting to go back and look at some of those ideas now and see if there's anything worth salvaging from that kind of dialogue, because of course you could see how easy it would be to apply something like that to Majerus, but I wonder really what was happening, during those years, like what really. Anyway, so that's a kind of non-answer, I would say.
Okay, but
over and out.
Yeah. I'm insisting because I just have another thought about this authorship part. Isn't it also the question of what you are dealing with? I mean, if we look at Warhol, Warhol also played with authorship, and he used also all these commercial images, signs, and what so on. And Michel also, when he used the Nike sneakers and so on, and you as well with Pac-Man and all the other figures you took from these gaming sphere. I mean, do you have? Isn't it also like the moment you take and you remix? Isn't it a different authorship in a way?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, of course, I think it's good that you're pushing on me a bit, because of course I was doing this in exactly these years, so I should be able to answer it. I mean, for me, it's material, and he used both material like logos and things like this, but also artists as material, or entire artists or entire movements. And it's simply just another material, really. I mean, that's how I looked at it then. And it's another material, but it's also another context. So when you do something with a video game, or take something with a video game, you also have to wrestle with how that is perceived in the world. And you have to wrestle with what it means when you bring it into the context of fine art. And so he, of course, was aware of all of this, So there's a lot, it's maybe a bit more than just re-authoring. It's like a, what do they call, like a 360 degree shift when you use these items and then drag it into the fine art world. And you could even see it, how I misread it when I was a young artist, and I should have been the person who exactly knew how to read it, So it's complicated. Yeah.
But I think what's unique also about his kind of sampling or references is that, in comparison to Warhol, who was appropriating from the commercial sphere, Majerus also brought in art historical moments and painters, and directly took certain painters' work alongside pop media. And that requires a certain sense of humility, I think. And also confidence, as Corey said.
No, it's great.
And they're related. They're exactly the same thing: humility and confidence, ego, and you can't have one without the other.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. In Zen Machine is this big installation we're also going to show next year. It's like we have Kraftwerk, we have an abstract painting of Gerhard Richter, and we have the test image of German TV during the night. I mean, it's quite an interesting mix of references, but it shows pretty well that contemporaneity of that time. There's another aspect I was thinking while especially listening to Sarah's and Ingrid's talk today. I haven't thought about Virilio for a very, very long time, but it came up, especially I was thinking of the book, The Year 2000 Will Not Happen. I just know the German title, so I think the English title is different. But it is also, for me, he was a very fast artist, and there was a certain pace in everything, and this pace also informed his artworks in a way, or that's also why these artworks look like they turned into their specific look. Do you have, Sarah, could you again talk a bit about acceleration, about the acceleration part?
Sure. I think somebody earlier asked a question about the way of production in the studio to Fabian, and maybe I can add to that from speaking to Bastian Krondorfer, who he worked with, or who worked with him, with Majerus in the studio, and specifically talking about this Pop as Terror series of paintings. He mentioned that they would paint sort of against each other, like to see who could do it faster, and this was actually part of the practice, right? So it was like a strategy in order to produce these kind of paintings and to make them, as you said, look the way they look. And I thought this was interesting also when thinking about this question of animation and how you bring this like flow or this idea of flow into this two-dimensional painting plane. I would probably pass the Virilio question on to you, because I know that had been referenced quite often by critics, but then on the other hand it said, or I read that Majerus himself would reject the references to acceleration or speed. Although of course we see it a lot in the, the letterings and everything that he uses, but they're also taken from a cultural underground that was obsessed with speed.
Yeah, I also find it complicated because for me Virilio is very rooted in a certain university and academic French lineage. And if you add to that it has been mistranslated, and it's only through mistranslation that it has entered more pop cultural spheres, I find it very difficult. But maybe what I could add to this question would be maybe less about speed than about a certain texture of anonymity, which I think go together. And maybe the fact that the paintings and the imagery appear so smooth, and to me smoothness is correlated with speed in a way. It's also because you have this very 90s idea, which is anonymity, which will become collectivity afterwards, but it's still about dissolving oneself in this texture. And it's a bit the way why it's interesting to me that he's also still a painter, where I could just have been a collage artist, or like if you want to follow this strand of speed. And I feel it's a way of how do you remain a subject while still being conscious of existing in this sphere that is pushing you toward anonymity. So I feel that there is still actually an attempt maybe not to go with the speed, but retain a little bit from that. And this also has to do with this idea of paranoia that I was speaking about, in the fact that for me, the fact that he's painting is a question I was asking myself, why did he need to paint? Because his images don't need that. It could have been the same with collage, for instance. And I feel for me, it's really, there is this aspect of not going crazy, and you need to understand where you are, and the act of painting. And when you see him in his studio, and he was a conscious studio artist, I feel that there is this double edge, actually, of trying to remain someone painting in a certain frame of reference while still acknowledging the speed and the multiplication and the fact that he is remaining anonymous but still performing.
I mean, it's totally interesting that he's touching so many buttons. It's like, I would say, yes, it makes completely sense. For me, he's in a painterly tradition. When I look at the history of painting, for me, it's totally clear. But on the other side, there are people who not like Cory, and maybe also you, why did he do painting? Cory says, I don't see him as a painter. I mean, this is like the complexity he was based in. And what I also like, I'm jumping now, is that you turned to the Berlin Biennial. It is so interesting. For me, it was the last really interesting Berlin Biennial. There were many interesting works in the other ones as well, but as a statement, and it was not a very successful one. A lot of people didn't like it. But there is a certain culture, there's a certain digital culture that was played out, and nowadays we have a culture where painting is completely important again. I mean, look at Paris International was almost only painting. You know, it's, I think this is also the complexity he was dealing with.
Yeah, it's a bit, I mean, we were speaking very briefly about this, but I think it's also something that's reverberating a bit in all the intervention. I was thinking especially about yours, Fabian, saying that you need to be time specific to look at his work, and it's a bit what he's learning us as well. And I think that the fact that we are living in harder times today, it's a bit why we turn to painting maybe as a frame, but smaller paintings and things we can maybe more control, because the Berlin Biennale, it was maybe the last moment where there was still enough hope to indulge in this kind of practice. So yeah, that would be my...
Yeah, to add to this, I mean, I agree, it was the kind of like, in its form as a biennial, it was probably the most radical version of such a big exhibition since a while. Not my cup of tea, probably, but like in that sense of what it did, it was super interesting, because it was bringing together all these voices of this kind of like seemingly huge kind of like post-internet generation. And then to look at it today, there's so many of these artists that actually not working as artists anymore, that just stopped, but it reflected so precisely on this time. And now we live like almost in a kind of Biedermeier renewal, where like you go back home to your studio, you lock yourself in and you paint and read poetry, and then you drink a cup of tea.
Well, it makes me think of also of Maximiliano Gioni's Venice Biennale, which was this return to the haptic and this return to handmade objects and craft and outsider art, and it had this completely different I mean, this was also, I think, before. I think his Biennale was maybe 2013. But of course, post-internet had been, you know, a really prevalent aesthetic for a very long time. And I'm trying to trace some thoughts together, but what I find interesting about the DIS Biennial is that it was very sculptural. You know, they really, really worked through objects, like a lot of these artists, and also installations and, you know, billboards, for example. And there wasn't a lot of painting. So it's interesting to think through how these things are connected, and especially with Ingrid's presentation. And I just am reflecting back on what Bettina has said about how, for her, it's so clear that he's a painter in terms of how he fits into painting history. And that's also how I feel. And when I think about the speed in which he worked, I also think about de Kooning, for example, and de-skilling, and the idea of jamming and working with your left hand because you become too good at painting with your right hand. I mean, these kinds of games that painters play in order to kind of work through a certain vernacular. And yeah, it would be super interesting to see what also he would think about the Berlin Biennale and how his work would fit into that visual language and what painting does in that kind of, rubric.
Yeah, but it's interesting. Like, I think it's also like a lack of vocabulary that we have at hand to talk about it at some point. I sometimes feel like, as Corey said, like when he worked like as a internet artist, the idea of internet artist and always like, it's something that happens on the screen and it looks strange, and then it's internet art, and then museums like adopted it and they showed it like in the basement, under the stairs, in a dark corner, on a computer, connected to the internet, to the world. Like vocabulary in terms of like how you talk about the practice, like Majerus, coming from Luxembourg, studying in beautiful Stuttgart, and then coming to Berlin, and suddenly Berlin is this kind of like the internet alive somehow. Everything happens at the same time, but like then you have the institution, and the institution usually shows artists and their work, but also institutions are limited in this discourse and like try to like slowly kind of like extend their own vocabulary, slowly becoming something different. And I think it's going somehow, it should go like hand in hand, that we kind of try to extend our own, at least as curators, extend our own vocabulary of like understanding artistic practices in a wider context, while everything else at the same time is developing further in some way. This is a difficult statement, also a question to myself.
Sarah, can I briefly add to that? I think that's a great thought that you just shared. And maybe this also goes back to the question of the political. And I would say, for example, that the rave culture or the club culture in Berlin was pretty political, and maybe it was in these terms actually political in a sense that it was really a broadening of like terms such as like painter or installation art or whatever, and maybe we should think of Majerus's work more in terms of environments than like not as like single individual works or like discrete entities, but more, the way he painted in this like modular way, like making small parts that together they would form a big painting. And I think this, together with like the floor that makes a sound when you walk over it and so on and so forth, I think we should kind of think of this more in terms of environments, maybe.
I think that is yet also a very good wrap-up. Are there questions from the audience? Nothing. Okay. Before I say a very warm welcome to Sam Tonson. Merci pour d'être ici. Thank you to all of you. Corey, for you, have a fantastic opening on Friday. I'm going to think of you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for this very interesting discussion and the wonderful talks. And maybe we stay here, and I hand over to Madame Tonson.
I have to catch a cab. I'm so sorry, but I have to go to the airport.
I take your seat. Thank you.
Be part.
Yes, I prefer that. Well, then before you leave, thank you for having been here. I just had the last 30 minutes, I think, of your talk that I could listen to, and it was really interesting. And I'm a little bit sorry that I did not hear all of it, because I even understood everything, even if I'm not an expert, but just a minister for culture in Luxembourg. So first of all, thank you for being here. I think that it is a hard time also for you as a family, because as you might know, only 4 days ago we thought a lot about the crash that has just happened 20 years ago. So as someone close or family member or friend of Michel Majerus, I imagine that it is a specifically hard time for you now. So thank you for being here and supporting this really precious initiative. But it is also a very relevant time to discuss this, because from what I remember, Michel Majerus was mainly discovered of the larger, broader public in Luxembourg after the accident, after his death, when there was a lot more talk about him at that time. And he maybe never had the recognition that he has now here in Luxembourg. So it is really great of you also, Bettina, and the Mudam team to organize this symposium today, in being part of this German initiative of the Michel Majerus 2022. So I think it's really important to have talks about Michel Majerus' work and his relevance here in Luxembourg, to also remember what important artist he has been and he still is, and remember that he comes from Luxembourg, and what perspectives this also gives to artists from Luxembourg. Then one last word, because I have been to the estate of Michel Majerus a few years ago, and I was really impressed by the work that is done there. And it also really helps to understand for a non-professional the work of Michel Majerus. And I don't remember now who talked about the notebooks of Michel Majerus, but that really gave me a new perspective of his work and the way he approached his artistic work. And I was again then impressed by how contemporary his work also is. So this just from my small perspective. Thank you really for being here and for putting this on the agenda. Thank you.
Okay, for me, a last word. Thank you again, the estate. Thank you again, the family. Thank you again, all speakers. Thank you again, Clémentine et Joël. You did a fantastic work on this. And we're gonna have drinks at our bar, so you're all invited and we can continue the discussion. Okay, thank you very much.